Part 1, Chapter 4 of Family Happiness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Family Happiness by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. Part 1, Chapter 4. It was the fast of the Assumption, and therefore no one in the house was surprised at my resolution to prepare for the sacrament during these days. During that entire week he did not once come to see us, and I was not only not surprised or alarmed or hurt, but, on the contrary, I was glad that he did not come, and I only expected that he would come on my birthday. During that entire week I got up every morning early, and while they were harnessing the horses I would wander alone through the garden and meditate on the sins that I had committed the day before, and consider what I ought to do on the present day in order to be satisfied with my time and not fall deeper into sin. At that time it seemed to me so easy to be absolutely without sin. It seemed to me that all that was necessary was to try. As soon as the horses were put in, I would take Katya or one of the maids and drive, in our two-seated droshky, 3 versts, to church. On entering the church I always remembered that prayers were offered for all who came in the fear of God, and I took pains to mount the 2 grass-grown steps of the porch under the influence of this feeling. At this time of day there were never more than 60 of peasants or household serfs in the church preparing for the communion, and I tried with strenuous humility to respond to their salutations, and I myself went to the candle cupboard to get tapers of the old soldier who served as a sacristan, and I placed them before the icons, and this seemed to me to be a meritorious action. Through the holy gate I could see the altar cover which Mamma had embroidered. On the iconastas were the 2 angels spangled with stars, which when I was a little girl had seemed to me so huge, and the dove with the yellow nimbus which used to engross my childish attention. Behind the chancel rail could be seen the modelled font, at which I had stood so many times as godmother for the children of our house serfs, and where I myself had been christened. The old priest came in his chasuble, made of cloth that had been my father's pall, and read the church service in the very same tone in which he had so many times read it, since my earliest remembrance, at our own house, at Sonia's christening, at my father's requiem mass, and at my mother's funeral. And the precentor's trembling voice, as it echoed through the choir, was the same. And there was the same old woman whom I always remembered to have seen at church at every service, as she stood all bent over next to the wall, looking with tearful eyes at the icon on the chancel, and pressing her clasped hands to her faded shawl, and mumbling prayers with her toothless mouth. And there was nothing at all in this to arouse my curiosity, nor was it dear to me from the associations alone, but it was all grand and holy now in my eyes, and it seemed to me full of deep significance. I listened to every word of the stated prayers, and endeavoured to respond to them with my feeling, and where I failed to understand the full depth of them, then I mentally implored God to enlighten me, or, in place of the prayer that I could not understand, I murmured one of my own inaudibly. When the prayers of repentance were read, I recalled my past, and that childish, innocent past seemed to me so black in comparison with the present, enlightened states of my soul, that I wept and was terrified. But at the same time I felt that all was forgiven me, and that if my sins had been even more heinous, my repentance would have been correspondingly sweeter. At the end of the service, when the priest said, "The blessing of God be upon you," it seemed to me that I felt a physical sense of well-being instantly take possession of me. A peculiar feeling of light and warmth, as it were, suddenly flowed into my heart. When the service was over, the good father would come to me and inquire if it would not be a good plan to have a vesper service at our house, and when he should come. But I thanked him warmly for his offer, because I felt that it was for my sake that he suggested it, and I told him that I would come to him or would let him know. "Do you wish to give yourself the trouble?" he asked. I did not know what answer to make, for fear of laying myself open to the sin of pride. After Mass I always sent the carriage home unless Katya were with me, and returned alone on foot, humbly bowing low to all I met, and trying to find some opportunity of doing good, giving advice, sacrificing myself for someone, helping lift a load, rocking a child, or stepping out into the mud to make room for someone to pass. One evening I heard the overseer telling Katya that Semyon, one of the peasants, had come to beg for some boards to make a coffin for his daughter, and a little money for a mass, and that he had given it. "Why, are they so poor?" I asked. "Very poor, they can't even get enough to eat," replied the overseer. Something seemed to clutch my heart, and at the same time I felt a sort of joy at hearing this. Giving Katya the impression that I was going out for a stroll, I ran upstairs, collected all my money, it was very little, but all that I had, and, crossing myself, I went alone into the terrace, and through the garden into the village to Semyon's cottage. This was at the very end of the village, and I, without being seen by anyone, went up to the window, laid the money on the sill, and tapped on the glass. Someone came out of the cottage, making the door creak on its hinges, and called to me, but I, trembling and chilled with dread, ran home like a transgressor. Katya asked me where I had been, and what was the matter with me, but I did not even comprehend what she asked me, and I made no reply. It all suddenly seemed to me so mean and petty. I shut myself up in my room, and for a long time walked up and down, unable to act, or to think, or to account for my feeling. I thought of the pleasure which the whole family would feel, of the blessings which they would shower down on the one who had bestowed the money, and I began to feel sorry that I had not myself given it to them. I also thought what Sergyei Mikhailitch would say if he knew about this foolish freak of mine, and I was glad enough that no one would ever know anything about it. And I had such a sense of joy, and all, including myself, seemed so contemptible, and yet I looked with such kindly feelings upon myself, and upon all, that the thought of death came to me like a vision of happiness. I smiled and I prayed and I wept. And what a passionately ardent love for myself and for everyone else in the world I felt at that moment. I read the Gospel as it is found in the prayer book, and more comprehensible seemed to me this book, and more attractive and simple the story of that divine life, and more terrible and impenetrable the deep feelings and thoughts which I found in its doctrines. But for that very reason how clear and simple everything seemed to me when, after laying down this book, I again directed my thoughts and observations to the life about me. It seemed to me so hard not to live aright, and so simple to love everyone and to be loved by all. All was so kind and sweet to me, even Sonia, to whom I continued to give lessons, was entirely different, and tried to understand me and to satisfy me and not to give me annoyance. All behaved toward me as I myself behaved. In trying to think over those who were offended with me, and whose forgiveness I ought to ask before a confession, I recalled only one, a young lady, a neighbour. I had laughed at her a year before in the presence of guests, and she had ceased to visit me. I wrote her a letter confessing my fault and asking her forgiveness. She replied in a note, granting it, and, in her turn, asking me to forgive her. I wept with delight as I read these simple lines, in which at that time I could see a deep and touching significance. My old nurse wept when I asked her to forgive me. Why are they all so kind to me? What have I done to deserve such love? I asked myself, and I involuntarily recalled Sergyei Mikhailitch, and for a long time thought about him. I could not do otherwise, and I did not look upon it as an impropriety. I thought of him now, however, in an entirely different way from what I did that night when, for the first time, I realized that I loved him. I thought about him just as I did about myself, and naturally he entered into every plan concerning my future. The impression of superiority which his presence made upon me entirely disappeared from my imagination. I now felt myself on an equality with him, and, from the height of the spiritual mood to which I had reached, I thoroughly understood him. What had hitherto been strange in him now became clear to me. For the first time I understood why he declared that happiness consisted only in living for others, and now I was in perfect accord with him. It seemed to me that we should be so endlessly and serenely happy together, and no thought entered my mind of journeys abroad, or of gay society, of brilliant life, but something entirely different, a quiet domestic life in the country with constant self-sacrifice, with constant love for each other, and with constant acknowledgment of a kind and helpful providence in all things. I partook of the Holy Communion, as I had proposed to do, on my birthday. My heart was so full of happiness when I returned that day from church that I dreaded life, dreaded every impression, everything that might in the least disturb such happiness. But as soon as we had dismounted from our droshky and were mounting the steps, the well-known cabriolet rattled across the bridge, and I saw Sergyei Mikhailitch. He congratulated me, and we went together into the reception room. Never, since our acquaintance began, had I been so calm and self-possessed as I was that morning. I felt there was within me a whole new world, high above him, and of which he was ignorant. I did not feel in his presence the slightest restraint. He must have understood something of this, for he was affectionately gentle toward me, and treated me with a peculiarly religious deference. I went to the piano, but he shut it, and put the key in his pocket. "Don't destroy the spell that holds you," said he. "Your soul is now full of harmony better than any earthly music." I was grateful to him for his thoughtfulness, but at the same time I felt a little disappointment that he should too easily and clearly read all that ought to be kept a secret from everyone, in my soul. After dinner he said that he had come to congratulate me, and at the same time to say good-bye, as he was going to Moscow the next day. In saying this he looked at Katya, and then he gave me a fleeting glance, and I saw how he feared to witness the emotion in my face. But I was neither surprised nor annoyed, and I did not even ask him whether he should be gone long. I knew that he would say those words, and I knew also that he would not go. How I knew I can never, even to the present day, explain to myself. But on that memorable day it seemed to me that I knew everything, whatever had been and whatever would be. I seemed to be in a blissful dream, when things that have not yet taken place seem to be already in existence, and long ago a part of one's knowledge, and yet all is still to come, and you know that it is to come. He intended to go away immediately after dinner, but Katya, who was tired in consequence of the service, went to lie down for a little while, and he was obliged to wait till she had finished her nap, so as to say good-bye to her. The sun shone brightly into the drawing-room. We went out on the terrace. As soon as we had sat down, I began with perfect serenity the conversation that was destined to decide the fortune of my love, and I began to speak at the very moment that we sat down, neither sooner nor later, so that nothing had as yet been said, when there was nothing as yet to give a different tone or character to our talk, or to affect unfavourably what I wanted to say. I myself could not understand whence came the calmness, decision, and accuracy that marked my expression. It seemed as though it were not myself, but something quite independent of my will, that spoke in me. He took a seat in front of me, leaning his arm on the balustrade, and, drawing down toward him a branch of lilac, began to pull off the leaves. When I began to speak he let the branch fly back and rested his head on his hand. This might have been the attitude of a man perfectly calm or very much agitated. "Why are you going away?" I asked, in a significant tone, deliberately, and looking him full in the face. He did not answer at once. "Business," he exclaimed, dropping his eyes. I saw how hard it was for him to tell me a falsehood in answer to a question put with such frankness. "Listen," said I, "you know what this day is for me. In many ways this day is very important. If I ask you the question, it is not out of mere compliment. You know that I am so used to seeing you and that I am fond of you, but I ask you because I must know. Why are you going?" "It is very hard for me to tell you the truth in regard to this," said he. "This past week I've thought so much about you and about myself, and I've come to the conclusion that it is my duty to go. You know why, and if you are fond of me you will not ask me." He rubbed his forehead with his hand and shut his eyes. "This is hard for me, but you understand." My heart began to throb violently. "I cannot understand," said I. "I cannot. You will tell me. For heaven's sake, for the sake of this day, tell me. I can hear the whole calmly," said I. He changed his position, glanced at me, and again pulled down the branch. "Besides," said he after a pause, and in a voice that vainly tried to be firm, "though it is stupid and impossible to put into the words, though it is hard for me, I will try to explain to you," he went on, contracting his brows as though with physical pain. "Well?" said I. "Imagine that there was a certain gentleman, let us call him A," said he, "old and weary of life, and a lady young and happy, who has never as yet seen society or life. In various family relations he had learned to love her as a daughter, and never imagined loving her otherwise." He paused, but I did not interrupt him. "But he forgot that B was so young that life for her was still a plaything," he went on, suddenly beginning to speak rapidly and resolutely and not looking at me, "and that he might easily learn to love her in a different way, and that this would be sport for her. And he himself was deceived, and suddenly woke to the consciousness that another feeling, heavy as regret, had taken possession of his soul, and he was frightened. He was frightened lest their former friendly relations might be interrupted, and he resolved to depart before they should be interrupted." In saying this, he again, as it were, carelessly rubbed his eyes with his hand and closed them. "Why, pray, should he be afraid of loving her in a different way?" I asked, in a scarcely audible tone. I controlled my agitation, and my voice was calm, but he really seemed to think that I was jesting. He replied in a tone that showed he was evidently offended. "You are young," said he, "and I am no longer young. You enjoy trifling, but I must have something else. Trifle as much as you like, only not with me. Otherwise, I verily believe, I should do something rash, and you would feel sorry. This is what A said," he added. "Well, it may be all nonsense, but you understand why I am going. And now let us not say anything more about it, please." "No, no, we will speak more about it," I cried, and the tears made my voice tremble. "Did he love her or not?" He made no reply. "But if he did not love her, why has he trifled with her as with a child?" I demanded. "Yes, yes, A was to blame," he answered hastily, interrupting me. "But all that came to an end. They parted, friends." "But that is terrible. And was there no other possible ending?" The words were barely out of my mouth when I was appalled at my temerity. "Yes, there is," said he, uncovering an agitated face and looking straight at me. "There are 2 different ways of ending it. But for heaven's sake do not interrupt me, and hear me calmly. Some say," he began, standing up and looking at me with a painfully sad smile, "some say that A became crazy, fell madly in love with B, and told her so. But she only laughed at him. For her this was merely amusing, but for him it was a matter of life and death." I shivered and tried to interrupt him, to tell him that he had no right to speak to me, but he restrained me, laying his hand on mine. "Stop," said he in a trembling voice. Others may say that she had pity on him, that she imagined, poor little girl who has never seen much of the world, that she might really love him, and so consented to be his wife, and he was mad enough to believe it, to believe that his life might begin anew. But she herself saw that she was deceiving him and that he was deceiving her. "Let us not say anything more about this," he concluded, evidently not having the force to speak further, and he began silently to walk up and down in front of me. He said, "Let us not say any more about this," but I saw that, with all the powers of his soul, he was waiting for my reply. I wanted to speak, but I could not. Something seemed to oppress my breast. I looked at him. He was pale and his lower lip quivered. I felt sorry for him. I put forth all my strength and, suddenly breaking the chain of silence which bound me, I said in a weak, choking voice which I feared each second would fail me, "But there is a third ending," said I, and paused. But he was waiting in silence. "But there is a third ending, that he did not love, but he gave her deep, deep pain and thought that he was doing right, and went away and prided himself on doing so. On your side and not on mine is the trifling. From the first day I have loved you, yes, loved you," I repeated, and at the word loved my voice, in spite of myself, changed from a gentle tone to a wild shriek which frightened me. He stood all pale before me, his lips quivered more and more, and 2 tears rolled down his cheeks. "It is cruel," I almost screamed, and I feared that I should suffocate with angry, unwept tears. "What is the reason?" I cried, and got up to leave him. But he would not let me go. His head bent forward on my knees, his lips were kissing my trembling hands, wet with his tears. "My God, if only I had known," he cried. "What is the reason? What is the reason?" I kept repeating, but my soul was already full of joy, a joy never to be taken from me, never to be repeated. In 5 minutes Sonia ran upstairs to Katya and was shouting all over the house that Masha was going to marry Sergyei Mikhailitch. End of Part 1, Chapter 4.